Warriors coach criticizes Jordan Poole's defense, careless. The point guard has been charged by Steve Kerr in the past for improved effort and defensive performance. Jordan Poole is the Golden State Warriors' top rising young talent, but not because of his defense. The excellent offensive performance of the wing guard contrasts, for now, with a poor performance on the other side of the court. Coach Steve Kerr came to demand improvement from the commander in the matter during an off-season. And, as much as there is evolution, he still sees it short of what is necessary. I think Jordan has been improving on the defensive side of the court, but he needs to be more consistent. I asked for a timeout in the second quarter of one of the last games, for example, because he is still careless at times. He was careless with the player who scored in 2 possessions in a row and, therefore, we conceded 6 points in the opportunity. That can never happen, tells the experienced trainer. The defensive potential of the reserve does not excite the fan, but Kerr bets that he can grow in the role. He warns, at the same time, that there is a quality that is not negotiable for him to get there. What I love about Jordan is that he's easy to train. There are several things you can improve on. He has an enormous talent, which encourages him, but nothing can replace his will to improve himself, he signaled. Kerr has been challenging Jordan Poole to make his impact felt on defense for some time behind the Warriors' sidelines. And, at first, it has seen pretty optimistic responses in recent weeks. That month, he scored an unprecedented streak in his career of 6 straight games with a block. The team's defensive efficiency, 111.7, when he's on the court, moreover, is better than the general time, 113.3. When engaged and attentive, Jordan can be one of the best defenders of our time. After all, he is strong, fast, and very athletic. Can stand in front of rivals while scoring without committing fouls. That's a great combination, certainly. However, first of all, you have to show commitment and will when you are on the defensive side. There's no getting away from it.